My name is Mara Whitcomb. I am 32 years old, and I learned my parents had sold the blueberry farm my grandfather left me when I saw strangers driving orange survey stakes into the north field. They were not walking carefully. They stepped over the low bushes like the land was already dead, one man holding a clipboard, another marking the ground near the old packing shed with white spray paint. For a moment, I just sat in my truck with both hands on the steering wheel. Pike Hollow had never looked expensive to people who did not understand it. 42 acres outside Cherryfield, Maine. Wild blueberry barrens, a crooked farm stand, a cold storage room that rattled every August, and a pond my grandfather Eldon used to call the insurance policy God forgot to charge us for. To my parents, it was dirt with taxes. To me, it was the only place in my family where being useful had ever felt like being loved. Then I saw the sign. Future site of Harborstone Blueberry Retreat. Luxury cabins. Wellness trails. Seasonal dining. The old wooden sign my grandfather carved himself was gone. I got out slowly. A man in a quilted vest smiled at me like we had an appointment. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "I didn't realize you were coming by today. Congratulations on the sale." I looked past him at the white circle painted around the packing shed door, the same door Grandpa taught me to brace with my shoulder during storms. "I didn't sell anything," I said. His smile disappeared. 4 days later, I stood inside my younger sister's new boutique while my stolen inheritance paid for white oak shelves, imported mirrors, sea salt candles, and champagne no one intended to remember. My mother raised her glass in front of half the town and thanked me for finally understanding what family required. I smiled at her and said, "Read the letter on Monday. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 51% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right." All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. Inside Juniper and Lace, everything looked soft enough to forgive itself. The walls were painted warm ivory. Linen dresses hung from brass rails in careful color stories, cream into sand, sand into pale blue into the kind of gray tourists called coastal. A table near the front held hand-poured candles with names like Low Tide and Sunday Fog. Behind the counter, my sister Lila had arranged imported scarves in shallow wooden trays, each one tagged with prices higher than Tobias paid for a week of diesel during harvest. She was good at surfaces. I will give her that. Lila could make a room believe in her before she had ever learned how to keep the lights on. She moved through the boutique in a white suit, kissing cheeks, touching elbows, laughing with her whole face whenever the photographer turned her way. People kept telling her how brave she was, how inspiring, how wonderful it was to see a young woman follow her dream in a town where retail space was impossible to get unless someone believed in you. My mother, Marianne, spotted me near the display of sea glass earrings and crossed the room fast enough to prove she had been watching the door. She kissed my cheek without touching my shoulder. "Thank you for being mature tonight," she whispered. That was my mother's gift. She could wrap a warning in a compliment so neatly that you almost thanked her for it. Then she stepped back and smiled for a guest from church, as if she had just blessed me instead of reminding me to behave. My father stood by the champagne table with two men I recognized from his old banking days. Calvin Whitcomb had the relaxed posture of a man explaining a smart investment. He had spent 30 years making bad news sound like responsible planning. I heard him say underused acreage and family liquidity before he noticed me listening. He did not look embarrassed. He lifted his glass half an inch, as if we were co-hosts at an event I had funded on purpose. A woman from my mother's church took both my hands and squeezed them. "Mara, what a generous thing you did for your sister," she said. "Eldon would have loved seeing the girls come together like this." I felt that sentence land somewhere behind my ribs. Grandpa Eldon kept invoices in a coffee can and repaired crate handles with wire because waste offended him more than poverty. He would have looked at the crystal pendant lights above Lila's register and known exactly how many irrigation filters they could have replaced. I smiled because the woman did not know. That was the worst part. Most people in that room were not cruel. They were just standing inside a lie that had been decorated beautifully. At 7 o'clock, Lila tapped a spoon against her glass. The room quieted in that pleased, expectant way people do when they believe they are about to witness gratitude. My mother stepped beside her. My father moved behind them. Together, they looked like a family portrait with one daughter missing from the frame. Then my mother turned toward me, smiled the smile she used when she wanted obedience to look like love, and opened her mouth. My mother leaned toward the microphone and said my name slowly, as if even the sound of it belonged to her. "There is one more person we need to thank tonight," she began, lifting her glass just high enough for the room to follow. "Mara has always been the practical one in our family, the grounded one. The one who understands that sometimes love means letting go of things we hold too tightly." A few people turned toward me with warm, approving faces. They thought they were witnessing generosity. They did not understand they were watching my mother place a ribbon around a theft. Lila stood beside her, eyes shining under the pendant lights. She pressed one hand to her chest, like the speech had surprised her, though I had watched her rehearse sincerity her entire life. My father gave a small nod, the kind he used when a loan closed or a difficult client finally accepted terms. Then he added, "It takes maturity to understand when an asset can do more for the family than it can do sitting in the ground." People murmured in agreement, because my father knew how to make taking sound like planning. My mother smiled wider. "Pike Hollow served our family for generations," she said, "and now, because Mara finally understood what her sister needed, it gets to serve us one more time." That sentence took the air out of me. Not because it was loud, because it was neat. My mother had folded the lie into something respectable and handed it to the room like a toast. Grandpa Eldon had not left Pike Hollow to us. He left it to me because I had shown up when the work was dirty and nobody was taking pictures. He left it to me because I knew which field flooded first, which cooler door stuck in August, and which rows needed hand-raking after a hard frost. But in that boutique, surrounded by polished counters and smiling guests, my years of work became a family resource. My grandfather's trust became my sister's opportunity. My silence became consent. And every person clapping helped make the lie sound official. Lila looked at me over the rim of her glass. There was no apology in her face, only relief, as if she had been waiting all night to see whether I would swallow the truth for her. I felt the old instinct rise in me. Smile. Stay calm. Do not embarrass your mother. Do not ruin your sister's moment. Explain later, quietly, in a room where nobody has to choose sides. That instinct had kept peace in our family for years, but peace had always meant I paid the difference. I set my untouched champagne on a passing tray and walked toward the front. My mother's smile sharpened when she saw me move. She thought I was coming to complete the performance. I stopped close enough for the photographer's camera to turn, close enough for the room to hear me without asking for the microphone. I looked at my parents first, then at Lila. My voice did not shake. "Read the letter on Monday," I said. For half a second, nobody moved. Then my father's jaw tightened. My mother blinked once, too quickly. Lila kept smiling, but her fingers closed around the stem of her glass until her knuckles went pale. I did not explain. I did not defend myself. I thanked the nearest server, picked up my coat, and walked out, while the room tried to decide whether it had just heard a blessing or a threat. Behind me, the applause did not return. That was the first honest sound I had heard in that room all night. I drove home from Juniper and Lace with the windows cracked, even though the September air had already gone cold. My hands still smelled faintly of the champagne glass I never drank. Behind me, my sister's boutique was glowing on Main Street, all ivory walls and gold lettering, but the farther I got from it, the more I could smell Pike Hollow in my memory. Wet leaves, cold soil, blueberry dust on wooden crates. The sharp metal breath of the old cooler before sunrise. To understand why that farm mattered, you have to understand that Pike Hollow was never beautiful in the way people use that word for magazines. It was 42 acres outside Cherryfield, tucked behind a narrow road most tourists missed. The packing shed had peeling blue paint. The farm stand leaned after every hard winter. The cooler rattled in August like it was arguing with the heat. There were no white fences, no curated rustic charm. It was work. Honest, stubborn, repetitive work. And to my grandfather, that made it sacred. I was 12. The first summer, he let me stay more than a weekend. My parents called it helping Grandpa, but I knew they also liked having one less child in the house during Lila's dance camps and sleepovers. Grandpa picked me up in his old green Ford before breakfast. He handed me a paper bag with 2 biscuits inside and said, "Eat now. The field won't care if you're hungry later." That was how he taught. Not soft, but never cruel. He believed children could learn hard things if adults did not make hardship feel like rejection. At Pike Hollow, nobody called me dramatic for asking questions. Nobody told me I should understand because I was older. Grandpa explained things until I understood them. He showed me how wild blueberry roots spread underground, how a field could look empty and still be alive, how the wrong tire tracks after rain could scar a row for years. He taught me to kneel, take soil in my palm, and smell it before trusting a report. "Numbers help," he would say, "but numbers don't bend down and look." Lila visited sometimes, usually in July when the barrens were blue enough for pictures. My mother dressed her in white and told her not to stain anything. Lila posed with a tin pail, smiling like she had discovered farming. After 20 minutes, she complained about bugs, heat, and the lack of cell service. Everyone laughed because Lila was delicate. I stayed after the photos were done and helped Tobias stack crates until my wrists ached. Nobody took pictures of that. I did not know yet that invisible work becomes invisible love if you let the wrong people define it. Grandpa saw it though. That was the difference. He noticed when I remembered which cooler shelf froze too hard. He noticed when I marked a broken latch with red tape instead of waiting for someone else to fix it. Once, after a storm knocked branches across the south field, we worked until dusk, dragging limbs to the burn pile. My sneakers were soaked. My arms were scratched. I was trying not to cry because I thought crying would make him regret bringing me. Instead, he sat beside me on an overturned crate and handed me a bottle of root beer from the cooler. "Mara," he said, "strong doesn't mean nothing hurts. It means you learn what is worth hurting for." I did not answer. I was 12. I only nodded and pressed the cold bottle against my wrist where a branch had scraped the skin raw. For years after that, whenever my parents called me the strong one, I remembered that Grandpa had never used the word as permission to hurt me. When he got sick, he stopped walking the far fields but still made me drive him out in the truck. He would sit with the window down, naming things that needed doing: fence line near the pond, drainage at the low bend, new belts for the sorter before harvest. He never spoke about death directly. He spoke about maintenance. That was his way of admitting he was leaving. The last clear conversation we had was parked at the edge of the north field, while the October wind moved through the barrens. He told me Pike Hollow did not need an owner who loved the idea of land. It needed someone who would answer the phone when the pump failed, show up when the frost warning came, and stay after harvest when there was nothing pretty left to photograph. 3 months later, the will named me. My parents did not argue in the lawyer's office. They were too careful for that. But after the will, Pike Hollow stopped being my grandfather's trust in their eyes. It became an amount they believed I was selfish for not spending on Lila. After the will, my parents never said Pike Hollow should have gone to Lila. Not directly. Directness would have made them sound greedy, and my parents cared too much about tone to risk honesty. Instead, they changed the language around the farm, one sentence at a time. It stopped being Grandpa's place, then it stopped being my inheritance. By the end of that first winter, Calvin called it underperforming land, and Marianne called it a heavy blessing, which was my mother's favorite kind of phrase because it sounded spiritual and resentful at the same time. I was not ignoring the farm. I was working 2 lives to keep it alive. Monday through Thursday, I was in Portland coordinating food contracts between small growers and school districts. Friday nights, I drove north with payroll reports, soil notes, and gas station coffee cooling in the cup holder. Weekends were for irrigation repairs, vendor calls, bakery deliveries, and listening to Tobias tell me which seasonal workers needed more hours before rent was due. Pike Hollow was not making anyone rich, but it was paying people, it was feeding children, it was still standing. To my father, none of that counted, because it did not look like growth on a spreadsheet. A farm is not a future, Mara, he told me one Sunday dinner, while cutting roast chicken into pieces too small to need cutting. It's nostalgia with property taxes. My mother sighed like he had said something painful but necessary. Lila looked down at her phone and kept scrolling. I said the farm had contracts, equipment, water access, and 4 families who depended on it. Calvin nodded the way men nod when they are waiting for a woman to finish being emotional. Lila's boutique started as a mood board spread across my parents' dining table. She called it Juniper and Lace, a coastal lifestyle concept, though she had never managed more than a seasonal register shift without quitting before Labor Day. There were linen dresses, imported candles, brass racks, a logo in soft gold, and a folder of influencer launch ideas. What she did not have was a budget that survived 3 questions. When I asked about lease terms, supplier minimums, payroll, insurance, and cash flow after the first month, Lila's mouth tightened as if I had insulted her character instead of her numbers. She needs encouragement, not an audit, Marianne said, moving one protective hand to Lila's shoulder. That was how it always happened. Lila wanted something, I asked what it would cost, and my question became cruelty. My sister's tears arrived quickly, cleanly, almost professionally. She said I had never believed in her. She said I enjoyed making her feel small. She said I could not stand the idea of her having something beautiful that did not belong to me. I remember staring at her mood board and thinking beauty had become a word people used when they did not want to say expensive. Calvin finally named the number. She needs $185,000 to launch properly. He said it calmly, as if we were discussing a roof repair. I asked where she expected to get that kind of money. Nobody answered right away. The silence was too practiced to be accidental. Marianne looked at me with the expression she used when she had already decided I would disappoint her. Your grandfather gave you more security than any young woman your age needs, she said. Your sister deserves a beginning too. I offered $15,000 from my own savings if Lila came back with a real business plan, independent financing, and a lease an attorney had reviewed. Lila pushed away from the table so hard her chair scraped the floor. Marianne wrapped both arms around her. Calvin's face changed then, not into anger exactly, but into disappointment, sharpened into strategy. Family assets should serve the family, he said. I answered before I could teach myself silence. Pike Hollow is not a family asset. It is legally mine, barely stable, and already supporting people who show up for work. My mother looked at me for a long time. One day, she said, you will learn that land matters less than people. I wanted to ask whether I counted as people. Whether Tobias did. Whether the lunch program did. Whether Grandpa's last clear wish did. But in that house, asking to be considered was treated like proof that I was selfish. So I folded my napkin, thanked her for dinner, and left before dessert. My father did not argue after that. He only went quiet, and with Calvin Whitcomb, quiet was never surrender. It was math. Less than 4 months later, an invitation arrived for the grand opening of Juniper and Lace. No one had asked me for money again. No one had mentioned the farm at dinner again. My mother's messages became soft and ordinary, all weather updates and church news. Lila posted renovation photos with captions about miracles, timing, and women finally choosing themselves. I watched the brass racks go up. I watched the logo appear on the glass. I watched silence turn into construction. That should have relieved me. Instead, it told me they had found another way. The first warning came 12 days before the grand opening. It was 5:42 on a Tuesday morning, and I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, waiting for coffee to finish dripping, when my phone lit up with a bank alert from Pike Hollow's operating account. 2 failed login attempts, both from a device near Camden, where my parents lived. I stared at the screen until the coffee maker clicked off behind me. For one foolish minute, I tried to make it innocent. An old password, a mistaken browser. My father had once helped with emergency paperwork after Grandpa's last hospital stay. I changed every password before sunrise. Then I added 2-step verification to accounts that should have had it already, because trust has a way of making basic caution feel insulting. By 8, I was telling myself I had overreacted. By 11:18, Tobias Reed called from the farm, and the sound of his voice took that comfort away. Tobias did not waste words. He had worked for Grandpa longer than some people stay married, and if he called in the middle of sorting equipment, something had gone wrong. "There are 2 men here asking for yield records," he said. "They say they're with the new ownership group." I pressed my hand flat against my desk. Around me, the nonprofit office kept moving. Someone laughed near the copier. Someone's lunch heated in the microwave. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, while the sentence split my morning in half. I asked him to repeat it, even though I had heard every word. Tobias said the men wanted crop reports, equipment inventory, water usage, and keys to the packing shed. They had been polite. That almost made it worse. Then Tobias lowered his voice. "Calvin came by last week, had papers with your signature, said you were selling because the place was too emotional after Eldon, said you didn't want calls until it was done." For a few seconds, I could not speak. My father had not just used documents, he had used my grief as a lock on everyone else's mouth. He knew people believed I kept pain private. He knew Tobias would hesitate before embarrassing me with questions. That was the thing about my father. He never needed to raise his voice when he could use what people respected about you against you. I told Tobias not to hand over keys, not to send records, and not to let anyone inside the cooler or shed without my direct written approval. My voice sounded calm enough that he obeyed without asking whether I was all right. After we hung up, I called my mother. No answer. I called my father. No answer. 40 seconds later, a text appeared from Calvin. "In a meeting. Don't overreact before we talk." I read it twice. Not "don't worry," not "what happened," not "I can explain." Don't overreact. That was when I picked up my keys. By noon, I was driving north toward Pike Hollow, and every mile made one thing clearer. My parents had not found another way to ask me. They had found another way around me. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking, let's begin the story. The road into Pike Hollow looked narrower than I remembered, or maybe fear had made every tree lean closer. By the time I turned off the county road, my phone had gone quiet, which felt worse than ringing. The gravel popped under my tires. Beyond the first bend, the north field opened in front of me, low and blue-green beneath the September sky. For 1 second, I let myself hope Tobias had misunderstood. Then I saw the empty posts where Grandpa's wooden sign used to hang. It was not on the ground. It had not fallen. Someone had removed it cleanly, bolts and all, like the farm's name was an inconvenience that needed clearing before construction could begin. In its place stood a temporary board with Harborstone's logo and a watercolor drawing of cabins arranged where the old barons. The words looked gentle. That made them crueler. People love soft language when they are preparing to destroy something. Orange flags cut across the field in a crooked line. One of them stood in the low patch Grandpa called the Old Women, because those bushes had been there longer than half the houses in town. Near the packing shed, a worker bent with a can of white spray paint and circled the concrete by the loading door. I got out before I knew I had opened the truck door. "Stop marking that building," I said. My voice carried harder than I expected. A man in a quilted vest turned toward me with a practiced smile. He introduced himself as Grant Huxley from Harborstone Retreats and said he was glad to finally meet me. Finally. as if we had been emailing for weeks, as if I had signed away my grandfather's land and then politely forgotten to attend my own goodbye. He said the demolition evaluation needed to be finished before the weekend, but he would be happy to walk me through the transition schedule. I asked for the closing file. Grant hesitated, then opened it on his tablet, still thinking he was helping the seller understand her own sale. The deed showed Pike Hollow transferred for $740,000. My stomach went cold. The last appraisal had been nearly twice that, and even that number had not counted what the farm meant to the people who worked it. My name sat at the bottom of the page in careful ink. Mara Elise Whitcomb. A signature that looked familiar only if you had never seen me sign anything after college. The acknowledgement had my middle initial wrong. The notary stamp belonged to a woman who, as far as I knew, had retired months earlier. The signing date placed me in Bangor, on a morning when I had been in Vermont, standing in a hotel conference room, speaking to school nutrition directors about local food purchasing. There were photos, receipts, a video recording, a name tag still sitting in the side pocket of my suitcase. Grant's expression changed while I photographed every page. Professional distance became professional fear. "Are you saying you did not authorize this?" he asked. I looked past him at the white circle drying around the packing shed door, at the place where Grandpa once taught me to brace my shoulder against the wind to keep that door from snapping back. My hands were steady then. Shock can do that for a person. It holds you upright until the truth finds somewhere deeper to land. "I am saying," I told him, "that my parents sold something they never owned." I walked back to my truck before he could answer. Only after I closed the door did my hands start shaking so badly I had to set the phone in my lap. My mother's number filled the screen when I opened my contacts. Some part of me still wanted an explanation that would leave me with a family. Then another bank alert appeared. Attempted transfer from sale proceeds account. I locked the screen and called a lawyer instead. I called Helena Cross from the shoulder of the road because I did not trust myself to drive yet. Helena was a real estate litigation attorney in Bangor, the kind of woman who sounded calm without sounding kind, which was exactly what I needed. I had met her 2 years earlier through a land preservation project, and I remembered how she could read a contract the way Tobias read weather. I sent her the deed, the photos, the bank alerts, the Harborstone sign, and a short message that said, "I think my parents sold my farm." She called back in 9 minutes. Not 10. 9. "Mara," she said, "do not call them yet." That was the first thing. Not "I am sorry." Not "maybe there is an explanation." Do not call them yet. She asked where I was, whether anyone from Harborstone was still on site, and whether I had touched any original documents. Then she told me to write down the exact time I arrived, the names of everyone I spoke with, and every sentence I could remember from Grant Huxley. By the time I reached home, Helena had already sent a secure folder. I uploaded everything. My Vermont conference schedule. The hotel receipt, from the night before the signing. A photo of me, at the podium timestamped 46 minutes after the deed claimed I was sitting in Bangor. The video link, the parking receipt, even the credit card charge for coffee in Burlington that morning. It felt ridiculous collecting proof that I had been where I knew I had been, but fraud works by making honest people prove the obvious. Helena did not promise victory. That made me trust her more. She said Harborstone might be an innocent buyer, and that would complicate everything. The deed could be challenged, maybe voided, but the land had to be protected before work began, and the money had to be frozen before it disappeared. "Your parents crossed a line when this was recorded," she said. "A bad dinner can stay in a family. A recorded deed belongs to the court." That sentence settled over me like cold water. I had spent my life shrinking things so they could fit inside the word family. My mother's favoritism, my father's dismissals, Lila's emergencies. But this would not shrink. This had page numbers, seals, escrow notes, transfer records. This had strangers walking my land with clipboards because my parents had given the lie enough paperwork to wear a suit. Tobias sent his statement that evening. He wrote exactly what Calvin told him, that I had approved a confidential sale, that I was too emotional to discuss it, and that staff should cooperate quietly until transition. Attached was the email Calvin had shown him. At first glance, it looked like mine. Same first name, same farm reference. But one letter in the domain was wrong. So small, I missed it twice. Helena saw it immediately. "Save the headers," she said. "Do not forward. Download." The domain had been registered days before closing. That detail made my stomach twist harder than the fake signature. A forged name could be panic. A false email address was planning. Someone had sat down, thought through who at Pike Hollow would believe they were protecting my privacy, and built a mask shaped like my voice. My father had not lost judgment for one desperate afternoon. He had constructed a silence around me, and then sold through it. The next file came from escrow after Helena made the first formal request. Calvin had told them I was unreachable because I was working in a rural food access region with unreliable service. Marianne added that the sale was emotionally painful and direct contact might destabilize me. I read that word 3 times. Destabilize. My mother had taken the same label she used at dinner tables when I objected and placed it in a business file so professionals would treat my absence like kindness. Helena's final message that night was brief. She was preparing an emergency complaint, a title notice, and a request to preserve remaining proceeds. She warned me that once filed, this could trigger a criminal referral whether I wanted one or not. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by printed pages, and stared at the signature that was supposed to be mine. For the first time since I saw the survey flags, I stopped asking why my parents had done it. I started asking how much of my life they had been practicing on. The money trail arrived the next morning in pieces. Helena sent each file with a sentence. Never more than she needed. The first transfer was $740,000 from Harborstone into an escrow account. From there, the funds moved faster than grief ever had. $185,000 went to Juniper and Lace, LLC. $96,000 paid down credit cards and personal loans under Leela's name. $48,500 covered renovation deposits, launch publicity, floral installation, and the champagne vendor from the opening night I had not yet attended. I stared at the vendor list longer than I should have. Champagne had an invoice number. White Roses had a deposit. The photographer had been paid in 2 installments. Everything that would later sparkle under boutique lights already had a line beside it, clean and traceable. That was what made it obscene. My parents had taken something muddy, living, and difficult, then laundered it emotionally into pretty receipts. They did not just spend the farm. They dressed it up and invited people to admire what they had done. The hardest document was not my father's authorization or my mother's email. It was Lila's loan paperwork. Under source of funds, she had written, "Family farm proceeds released with owner consent." Owner. That word sat there quietly, ruining every excuse I had tried to leave available for her. She knew the money did not simply belong to our parents. She knew there was an owner whose consent mattered. She did not have to forge my name to become part of the lie. She only had to sign beneath it. There was also an email from Nolan Mercer, her fiancé, asking whether I had really approved the sale. He wrote that he did not want legal trouble attached to the boutique before opening. Lila replied 16 minutes later. She said I would have refused just to control her, and that Mom and Dad had handled it. Then she added, "By opening night, it won't matter." I read that line once, then again. Until then, I had allowed myself to believe my sister was only spoiled. That email made her informed. Helena called after I sent back the marked pages. She said she was requesting an emergency preservation order and preparing to trace every dollar still reachable. "You can prefer restitution," she told me, "but you cannot turn a forged deed back into a misunderstanding." I wrote that sentence down, not because I needed it for court, but because I needed it for the part of me still trained to make betrayal sound accidental. That night, I wrote the letter. It was not long. It did not ask why. It did not call anyone cruel. It said Pike Hollow was never theirs to sell, my signature was never theirs to borrow, and my silence was never consent. The last line took me the longest. When I finally typed it, my hands were steady. You spent my inheritance in public. Now you will answer for it in writing. Helena did not want me at the opening. She said the complaint was ready. The exhibits were organized, and there was no legal need for me to stand in a room built from money we were about to freeze. I understood her point. I also understood my parents. If I stayed away, Marianne would tell people I was jealous. Calvin would say I had changed my mind after agreeing. Lila would cry beautifully and let everyone believe I had tried to ruin her first real chance. Absence had always been easy for them to rewrite. So I went. Not to confront them. Not yet. I went to observe the lie in its finished form. I wore a plain navy dress, the one I used for donor meetings when I needed to look serious without asking to be noticed. In my purse were copies of nothing. Helena had the documents. The court would have the documents. I had learned enough by then not to carry proof into a room full of people hoping I would make an emotional mistake. Marianne saw me first. Her relief was immediate and insulting. She crossed the boutique with both arms open, kissed the air beside my cheek, and whispered, "I knew you would do the right thing." The right thing. She meant standing still while she displayed what she had taken. Calvin pressed his hand between my shoulders for half a second, guiding me toward a cluster of guests, the way he used to guide clients towards signature lines. "Good girl," he murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Lila pulled me into a photograph near the front window. Her perfume was sweet and sharp, and her hand rested on my waist like we were sisters in a catalog. The photographer told us to lean closer. I did, not because I forgave her, because behind us, the gold logo, the imported mirror, and 2 tagged display tables all fit inside the frame. When the flash went off, I wondered whether Lila understood that some pictures become memories and some become evidence. For the next hour, I let people talk. A boutique owner from down the street praised my investment in young women. A friend of my mother's said sacrifice always came back as blessing. A lifestyle reporter asked if I wanted to comment on supporting local entrepreneurship. I told her only that family stories were often more complicated than they looked. She laughed politely, not yet knowing I had given her the most honest quote she would hear all night. At 6:52, Helena texted. Courier scheduled for Monday after hearing. Preserve your notes. I put the phone back in my purse and looked around Juniper and Lace one last time before the speeches began. The room glowed with borrowed warmth. Every candle, every glass, every polished surface seemed to be waiting for applause. My parents thought I had come to surrender. My sister thought opening night would make the theft irreversible. None of them understood that I was not there to stop the performance. I was there to remember every line. Monday morning did not feel dramatic. That surprised me. The hallway outside the Bangor courtroom was quiet, with vending machines humming at the far end and a janitor pushing a mop bucket past attorneys carrying coffee. At 7:30, I sat beside Helena with my hands folded over a yellow legal pad. My parents were not there. Lila was not there. They were still sleeping inside the version of Sunday night where my sentence had been rude, maybe jealous, but not dangerous. I envied them for those last few minutes of ignorance. Harborstone appeared by video. Grant Huxley looked tired and less polished than he had at the farm. His attorney told the judge the company had paused all non-essential work after learning title was disputed. I was grateful for that, though gratitude felt too small for the morning. Helena did not perform outrage. She simply laid out the documents in order, the deed. The wrong initial, the retired notary stamp, my Vermont conference records, the false email, the bank alerts, the transfers into accounts tied to Calvin, Marianne, and Juniper, and Lace. The judge read silently for a long time. Paper moved. A clock clicked. I kept my eyes on the edge of the table because looking hopeful felt unsafe. Then she asked one question about whether continued development could alter the property before title was resolved. Helena answered yes. Harborstone's attorney did not dispute it, At 8:37 a.m., the judge issued a temporary restraining order. She did not decide the whole case. She did something more urgent. She stopped everyone from making the truth impossible to recover. The order froze the traceable money still sitting in my father's controlled account. It barred demolition, grading, or transfer of equipment at Pike Hollow. It prohibited Juniper and Lace from moving high-value inventory outside monitored ordinary sales. It recorded public notice that the farm title was under litigation. Hearing those words felt nothing like revenge. It felt like someone had finally put a lock on a door my parents had been walking through for years while calling it love. At 9:05, the courier delivered the packet to my parents' house. Helena received the signature confirmation first. Marianne Whitcomb. 3 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate. I watched my mother's name appear, disappear, and appear again, then my father, then Lila. By 10 o'clock, there were 31 missed calls. By 11:40, there were 74. I listened to one voicemail. My mother started crying, then blamed me. My father called it a paperwork dispute until his voice cracked around the word freeze. Lila's message came last. She said I was destroying her future over land I barely used. She said the boutique had employees now, suppliers, guarantees, people depending on it. I placed the phone face down before she finished. For the first time in my life, I did not rush to absorb the consequences of her wanting something she could not afford. I opened the copy of my letter instead. It had arrived exactly where it needed to go. The case took 10 months, which is a long time for people who think truth should arrive like lightning. It did not. It arrived through title filings, insurance reviews, forensic accounting, mediation rooms, and signatures nobody could rush. Pike Hollow's deed was declared void because my parents had never had the authority to sell it. Harborstone released its claim after the title insurer stepped in. Grant Huxley sent me one email afterward, short and careful, saying he wished his company had called me directly before closing. I believed him. Not every person inside a bad transaction is the villain. The money was less forgiving. Calvin and Marianne had to sell the house they had lived in for 19 years. After legal fees, restitution, taxes, and settlement costs, they moved into a small condo behind a dental office in Augusta. My father lost the local consulting work that had let him keep pretending retirement was a choice. My mother was removed from the charity board she had once treated like a second living room. The public correction hurt her more than the money. She had to write to relatives, vendors, church friends, and every guest at the opening, admitting I had never approved the sale. Juniper and Lace lasted 11 weeks. It did not close because I hated Lila. It closed because a store built on stolen certainty could not survive ordinary pressure. The landlord reviewed the funding dispute and terminated the lease. Suppliers enforced guarantees Lila had signed without reading. The inventory that could be traced was placed under supervision, then sold toward restitution. Lila entered a repayment plan for $64,800. Nolan ended the engagement after reading her email about opening night. He told her failure was not the problem, knowing was. I went back to Pike Hollow before I went back to my apartment. Tobias was waiting by the packing shed with the old wooden sign leaning against the wall. He had found it in a storage trailer, scratched but unbroken. We hung it together that afternoon. No speech, no celebration. Just 2 screws, one level, and the wind moving low through the barrens. The first thing I did after the settlement was restore the crew's interrupted benefits. Then I called the bakeries, renewed the school lunch contract, and repaired the irrigation pond before frost. Later, I created the Eldon Pike Apprenticeship Fund for young workers learning soil care, berry production, and farm preservation. Helena helped me place the land under a conservation easement so no one could ever rush it toward a resort without independent review again. None of that felt dramatic. Protection rarely does. It felt like maintenance, which was how my grandfather had always described love when he was too proud to use softer words. That fall, my mother texted, asking to visit the farm. She said she wanted to stand where her father once stood. I read the message beside the packing shed, my thumb resting on the edge of Grandpa's carved sign. A year earlier, guilt would have opened the gate for her. This time, clarity kept it closed. I wrote back, "Pike Hollow has no room for people who only arrive when there is something to take." Then I put the phone away and walked toward the field, where the roots were still alive beneath everything they had tried to erase. Here is what Pike Hollow taught me. Sometimes the people who call themselves family are not asking for love. They are asking for access. Access to your time, your money, your silence, your forgiveness, your strength. And because they know the right words, they can make taking sound like need. They can make boundaries sound selfish. They can make betrayal sound like sacrifice. For years, I believed peace meant absorbing the damage quietly, so everyone else could keep feeling like good people. But peace that requires one person to disappear is not peace. It is a contract written by the people who benefit from your silence. My grandfather understood something my parents never did. Love is not measured by who shows up when the fruit is ripe and the pictures are pretty. Love is who stays when the field is muddy, when the pump fails, when the work is boring, when nobody is watching. The same is true in life. The people who deserve a place in your future are not always the ones who share your blood. They are the ones who protect what matters to you when it would be easier to take from it. I did not save Pike Hollow because land matters more than people. I saved it because people who truly love you do not ask you to destroy yourself to prove it. They do not turn your inheritance into their solution. They do not treat your strength as permission to hurt you harder. Healing did not come when my parents lost. It came when I stopped needing them to admit the truth before I was willing to live by it. Sometimes closure is not an apology. Sometimes closure is a locked gate, a restored sign, and the quiet knowledge that you finally chose yourself. If this story reminded you of someone who had to rebuild after being betrayed by family, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories coming about boundaries, resilience, and the moment ordinary people finally stop surrendering their lives to those who never valued them.